In 1759, the French Empire stood on the brink. Its American colony of New France was in peril. The British campaign of 1758 had shattered French control along the wilderness frontier. 13 native nations, once firm French allies, had sworn not to fight for them under the Treaty of Easton. Most devastating of all, however, the fortress of Louisbourg had fallen after a grueling siege by General Jeffery Amherst, opening the St. Lawrence to a British invasion. Meanwhile, most of France's resources were tied up in Europe, where the fronts of the 7 Years' War had become deadlocked, and hopes for a swift resolution on the continent's battlefields were fading fast. Seizing the opportunity, Britain's Secretary of State William Pitt resolved to deliver a painful blow to France by stripping it of its colony. With the momentum on Britain's side, he laid plans for an offensive that would drive the French from North America once and for all. William Pitt's strategy was straightforward. He wanted to strike at the St. Lawrence Valley from every direction to carry, quote, the war into the heart of the enemy's possessions, end quote. The man to execute this plan was Jeffery Amherst. At just 40, Amherst was young for the position of Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in North America, but his reputation for discipline and efficiency, along with his success at the Siege of Louisbourg, marked him as more than equal to the task. On the 9th of December 1758, Pitt called on the colonies to raise at least 20,000 provincial troops for next year's campaign. At the same time, he revealed the details of his plan to Amherst. The offensive would strike on 3 fronts. Brigadier General John Prideaux would push up the Mohawk River to seize Fort Niagara. Amherst himself would march against Fort Carillon, known to the British as Ticonderoga, then drive north along Lake Champlain. The main blow would fall under James Wolfe, who would sail up the St. Lawrence and capture Quebec. Ideally, all 3 forces would converge on Montreal. This strategy held few surprises. It largely continued the work of the previous year's campaign, except for one unexpected twist. James Wolfe, who had left Europe as a mere colonel in frail health, now returned to lead a full army. The beginning of 1759 was tense. London struggled to secure the vast funds required to finance its ambitious plans. Spies reported that French shipwrights at Le Havre were preparing vessels for an invasion of the British Isles, and Pitt remained largely in the dark about the Canadian campaign. Since Wolfe's departure for Louisbourg on the 14th of February, no reports had reached London. The only news came from Amherst, and it was far from encouraging. Preparations and recruitment, he warned, were slow and disorganized. Indeed, all 3 expeditions set out later than planned, though for different reasons. Wolfe had safely crossed the Atlantic, but a cold spring delayed the start of his campaign. The St. Lawrence River did not thaw until late April, and persistent heavy fogs prevented the Major General from rendezvousing with Vice Admiral Charles Saunders and his naval escort near the Isle of Beak. It was only in June that he finally set sail for Quebec. The other expeditions were delayed not by weather, but by resources. Years of war had left the economies of the northern provinces in ruin, and their public coffers depleted, and they struggled to field enough men and raise the necessary funds. Massachusetts, for example, carried a staggering public debt of £350,000. Despite these challenges, Amherst was able to persuade the colonies to raise the required forces, mainly due to the deft handling of provincial assemblies, promises of additional reimbursements, and a shift in public sentiment. Unlike his predecessors, Amherst treated the colonies as partners rather than subjects, asking for their help rather than demanding it. This approach dissolved much of their resistance and even sparked what Amherst described as zeal, a shared enthusiasm for the common cause of driving the French from America. Ultimately, the New Jersey, New York, and New England colonies fielded some 17,000 provincials to support the British regulars. With these forces in place, Britain was ready to deliver a decisive blow. While Prideaux, Amherst, and Wolfe were preparing to move north, Brigadier General John Stanwix kicked off 1759 by securing the conquests of the last campaign season. As soon as the snow began to melt, he returned to the western front to fortify the Ohio Forks and improve Forbes's Road, a logistical lifeline across the wilderness of Pennsylvania built the year before. This was important for two reasons. First, the garrisons at Pittsburgh and Fort Ligonier were eagerly awaiting supplies. Their food stores were running low because the French, when retreating the previous autumn, had stripped the region of its resources. Second, the French scorched earth policy threatened to unravel Britain's newly forged peace with the natives. For the Shawnees, Delawares, and Mingos of the Ohio Valley, withdrawing from their alliance with the French under the Treaty of Easton immediately triggered a subsistence crisis. The Anglo-Americans had promised profitable trade to replace French support, but by spring that promise proved hollow. Pennsylvania's assembly tried to prevent fraud by restricting trade to 3 posts: Fort Allen, Fort Augusta, and Pittsburgh, where goods would be sold at fixed prices. Getting these posts up and running, however, was painfully slow, increasing the risk that the native nations would renew their alliance with France. Luckily, the plan was dead even before the first trading goods reached Pittsburgh in April. Due to the dire situation of his garrison, Lieutenant Colonel John Mercer had allowed open trade to secure desperately needed supplies. The final blow to regulated commerce came with the arrival of Deputy Indian Agent George Croghan. As the thaw set in, George Croghan arrived at Pittsburgh at the head of a long pack train carrying the Crown's official peace gifts for the Ohio tribes. But his mission was not purely diplomatic. He had personal stakes as well. Back in 1749, he had secured the rights to 200,000 acres near the forks of the Ohio, close to the spot where the French had abandoned Fort Duquesne, and where Stanwix was now planning a new post. Croghan knew these crossroads would soon become a center for anyone living in the Ohio country, and saw an opportunity to get rich by trading furs with the tribes and selling land to settlers. A state monopoly on trade was not in his interest, and he began building a vigorous network of commerce. Whatever his motives, Croghan's efforts jump-started a trade on which native survival depended, and likely saved a fragile British-native truce. If you want to get the full picture of this conflict and understand how a frontier skirmish sparked the first true global war, you have to read Fred Anderson yourself. Crucible of War is a definitive masterpiece on the 7 Years' War, while The War That Made America offers a punchy, accessible deep dive that's also available on Audible as an audiobook. Check out the link in the description box to start your free trial on Audible, or simply buy the book by our Amazon link. This helps support the channel with a small commission at no extra cost to you. By mid-July, it was clear that Stanwix's men were building far more than a trading post. A British Army engineer had laid out a framework for a massive pentagonal fort to be named Fort Pitt that would command the confluence of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers. Its scale was staggering. A 5-bastion fortress with a diameter of more than 200 meters, with outworks enclosing nearly 70,000 square meters and barracks for 1,000 men. At this point, no one could mistake Fort Pitt for a temporary stockade or humble trading post. It was a declaration of permanence, a British citadel planted deep in native country, proof that despite the promises of the Treaty of Easton, the British had no intention of leaving once the French threat was gone. By midsummer, Pittsburgh was firmly under British control. This was not because of Fort Pitt or the settlers gathering at the forks of Ohio, but because of an event 200 miles to the north. The first army to move against New France was the Niagara expedition. In late May, Brigadier General John Prideaux left Schenectady and marched up the Mohawk River. He reached Fort Oswego on the 27th of June and was joined by Sir William Johnson, Britain's Indian agent in North America, and about 1,000 Iroquois warriors. Their arrival was unexpected. The Iroquois had long hesitated to actively aid the British after the Treaty of Easton. In the spring of 1759, that changed, because they now believed an alliance with Britain would help them maintain dominance over other native nations, some of which were preparing to form a confederacy, a rising power that could challenge Iroquois influence around the Great Lakes. By supporting the British assault on Fort Niagara, the Iroquois aimed to display their power and reaffirm their authority. After joining forces with the Iroquois, Prideaux left a strong garrison at Fort Oswego and pressed on by boat at the southern shore of Lake Ontario. 4 days later, his force came within sight of Fort Niagara, the last French stronghold on the lake. The imposing structure dominated the lake from a peninsula at the mouth of the Niagara River. Its commander, Captain Pierre Pichot, a skilled military engineer, had used the long months of isolation to transform his post into a formidable fortress. At the time, the only one in the North American interior to boast European-style outworks. In addition to his formidable earth and stone ramparts, Pichot relied on the support of the local Seneca band. In exchange for his pledge to not challenge their monopoly as carriers along the Niagara portage, they always warned him of impending threats, a foundation of their alliance for more than half a century. Pichot had no reason to doubt their loyalty, so when a large Iroquois war party attacked a working detail outside the walls on the 6th of July without warning, Pichot was stunned. When he saw British soldiers and their native allies landing at the shore in force, he hastily closed the gates and sent pleas for reinforcements to nearby Fort Michaud. He had not been prepared for a siege. 4 days later, the British opened their trenches. In desperation, Pichot called a truce and allowed Kainandae, chief of the Niagara Senecas, to try to persuade the Iroquois to change sides or at least remain neutral. For 3 days, Kainandae urged them to let the Europeans settle their own quarrels and withdraw up the Niagara River. He nearly succeeded, but when Johnson promised them the right to plunder the fort after its fall, they chose to stay. When the siege resumed on the 14th of July, Pichot, reluctant to keep warriors of doubtful loyalty within his walls, permitted Kainandae and his followers to depart. Pichot had bought himself a little time, but the British trenches crept ever closer. Soon, their artillery was in position and they opened fire. On the 17th of July, British howitzers across the river opened a deadly crossfire, enfilading the works. By the 20th, a heavy breaching battery was firing from less than 100 meters away. At that point, not even the death of Brigadier General Prideaux could halt the assault. At dusk, the young officer stepped into the line of fire of a mortar and was decapitated, leaving Sir William Johnson to assume command. 3 days later, the British trenches were within musket shot. The relentless hail of mortar bombs had smashed the largest bastion's battery to pieces, and a breach was opening up in the main wall. Just when all seemed lost, a relief force of roughly 1,600 French regulars, Canadians, and native allies appeared at the Niagara River. The garrison cheered, but Johnson had also spotted the column and swiftly blocked their way. His Iroquois allies persuaded the natives among the French to abstain from fighting, leaving only about 600 French and Canadian troops to press on. Johnson deployed 350 regulars behind a barricade near La Belle Famille, while an equal number of native warriors concealed themselves in the surrounding woods. When the relief force charged the British position, Johnson's men held their fire until the enemy closed, then unleashed a devastating series of musket volleys. The assault collapsed in minutes. Barely 100 Frenchmen survived long enough to be taken prisoner, while those who fled were hunted down and cut to pieces by the Iroquois emerging from the woods. Seeing his last hope shattered, Pichot surrendered. On the 25th of July, the French garrison was taken into British custody for transport to New York. As the prisoners boarded the ships, Iroquois warriors swarmed through Fort Niagara, stripping it of its valuables. Yet, unlike the infamous massacre at Fort William Henry 2 years earlier, no bloodbath followed. For the Iroquois, preserving the goodwill of the British now outweighed the lure of scalps and plunder. After the siege, Johnson rebuilt Fort Niagara, consolidated British control over the western end of Lake Ontario, and established friendly relations with the local Chippewas. The fall of Fort Niagara severed France's vital portage to Lake Erie and ended its influence in the region. Forced to abandon Forts Presque Isle, La Boeuf, and Machaut, the French effectively ceded control of the Great Lakes to the British. Now, the way down the St. Lawrence was wide open, and the French commander-in-chief, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm-Gozon, known as Montcalm, dispatched his most able commander, François Gaston, the Chevalier de Lévis, to safeguard Montreal's west. When Amherst learned of Niagara's fall, he was occupied with securing Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point. His own advance had been delayed until the 21st of July by logistical problems. Once underway, Amherst built Fort George to replace the destroyed Fort William Henry, then pressed on to Fort Ticonderoga. Here, just a year earlier, Montcalm had dealt a bloody defeat to a British assault. This time, however, the outcome was very different. After only 4 days, the French spiked their guns, blew up their magazines, and withdrew to Crown Point, where they joined the 3,000-strong force of Brigadier General François-Charles de Bourlamaque, tasked with defending Montreal's southern approaches. When Amherst sent rangers to scout Crown Point, they discovered that the French had also destroyed and abandoned the works of Fort St. Frederick. Suspecting a trap, Amherst slowed his advance, consolidated control of the southern reaches of Lake Champlain, and dispatched his rangers far and wide to gather intelligence. They soon reported that the enemy had fallen back to Île aux Noix, a fortified island at the foot of the lake. On paper, the route north was open, but Amherst hesitated. The French still had a small fleet of warships on the lake, while his own forces had only light boats. Before venturing further, Amherst wanted some floating firepower of his own. He ordered the shipwrights at Ticonderoga to build a brigantine, a sloop, and an armed raft. Amherst had even greater concern. He had heard nothing from James Wolfe since early July. With the fate of the Quebec expedition unknown, Amherst chose caution over risk. He secured his hold, constructing a massive new fort at Crown Point and cutting roads to link it with Ticonderoga and Fort No. 4 in the Connecticut Valley. Until his ships were ready, or word came from Wolfe, Amherst would consolidate and prepare the next push against New France. Major General James Wolfe arrived before Quebec on the 28th of June after a difficult passage up the St. Lawrence River. Montcalm, personally commanding the defense, watched from the heights as Wolfe's 9,000 troops set up camps on Île d'Orléans and Point-Lévis. Believing firmly that the city was the key to Canada, Montcalm had immediately begun preparing Quebec upon receiving intelligence of the impending attack. He was determined to stop the British at the city at all costs, and the odds were in his favor. Perched on a high promontory where the St. Charles meets the St. Lawrence, Quebec's walls rose from sheer cliffs, and its batteries commanded the river. In addition, Montcalm had fortified the shoreline with a line of redoubts and entrenchments stretching from the St. Charles River to the Montmorency Falls. He had turned the area surrounding Quebec into an obstacle field, manned by over 12,000 troops, militia, and native allies. By the 12th of July, Wolfe's batteries were in place, and the British artillery began a relentless bombardment. Red-hot shot and exploding shells set the city ablaze, and within days, entire streets were reduced to rubble. However, the defenses held firm despite the destruction. Wolfe realized that to take Quebec, he would need to cross the river and lay siege from the opposite shore. On the 31st of July, he launched an assault with about 3,500 troops attempting to land near Beauport. The attack quickly turned disastrous. The British forces suffered nearly 500 casualties, before a sudden thunderstorm allowed Wolfe to call off the operation and withdraw. After the failure at Beauport, Wolfe resorted to harsher measures. Abandoning hopes of storming the city's defenses, he ordered his men to lay waste to the surrounding countryside. They burned villages, destroyed crops, and drove inhabitants from their homes. By late August, the once lush landscape around Quebec had been reduced to a smoldering wasteland. The tactic was intended to starve the city and provoke Montcalm into open battle, but it came at a cost. As the weeks wore on, heat, disease, and dwindling rations sapped British strength. Wolfe himself grew gravely ill, whacked by fever and suffering from kidney stones. By early September, nearly a third of his army was unfit for duty, and desertions were mounting by the day. Time was slipping away. Wolfe knew he had to act, to somehow draw the French out of their entrenchments and force a decisive engagement. Since Quebec's defenses had proven impenetrable, Wolfe resolved to force Montcalm into battle by landing upstream from Quebec and cutting off his supply lines to Montreal. In early September, British ships transported several thousand soldiers upriver to Cape Rouge, where they awaited further orders. But the Major General remained silent. His health was failing rapidly, and he believed his days were numbered, which may have influenced his decision to attempt a risky landing near Quebec. He hoped to make a final stand, die a heroic death, and still give his men a chance to retreat safely. But things didn't go as expected. When Wolfe gave the order to prepare for battle on the 12th of September, he still hadn't revealed the landing site. Only when the small fleet set off downriver around 2 a.m. the next morning did he tell the captains to aim for a small cove about 3 kilometers upstream of Quebec, known as L'Anse-au-Foulon. Just before dawn, the first boats scraped the shore. Immediately, Lieutenant Colonel William Howe led a light infantry battalion up the 50-meter-high cliff to the promontory of Quebec and ambushed the small French camp guarding the path. After a brief exchange of musket fire, the passage was secured, and more men climbed up. On this side of the town, no additional trenches protected the city. Wolfe had outflanked Quebec's defenses. By full daylight, 7 British battalions were drawn up in battle order on the plains of Abraham, less than 2 kilometers of Quebec's western walls. Wolfe extended his line of battle and, rather than advancing or initiating a formal siege, chose to hold his ground. It took the French some time to react, as the British had deceived Montcalm into believing that another attack on Beauport was imminent. Believing the boats upriver were merely a diversion, Montcalm sent Bougainville with 2,000 men to Cape Rouge to cover his back and spent the entire night preparing Beauport's defenses. When dawn broke and no attack had materialized, Montcalm dismissed the alarm, sent his men back to their tents, and retired for some rest. The French commander-in-chief was only aroused from his bed when several desperate messengers came rushing in from the west. Unconvinced that the British could have landed in significant numbers, he hurried to personally assess the situations on the plains of Abraham himself. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. For a moment, he sat in his saddle, stunned. Once he regained his composure, he ordered his skirmishers to harass the British line. Wolfe's troops, however, held firm, displaying a level of discipline Montcalm knew his own forces, filled with inexperienced militia, lacked. The best he could do was to deploy his 4,500 men on the field. They were roughly equal in number to Wolfe's army. Meanwhile, a messenger was dispatched to ask Bougainville for support, making Wolfe's position precarious. By drawing up his forces on the open plains, he had placed himself, as historian Fred Anderson puts it, quote, between the hammer of Bougainville and the anvil of Montcalm. The only retreat was a narrow path down to the cove. What had begun as a cautious advance, designed to give Wolfe a chance for an honorable death, had turned into a make-or-break endeavor. At around 8 a.m., the fire of the defenders' skirmishers and artillery grew so intense that Wolfe ordered his men to lie down to avoid the barrage. That most likely saved the day, as from a distance, it gave Montcalm the impression that the British were preparing to lay siege to the city's undefended western wall. Believing he had no time to lose, Montcalm gave the order to attack around 10 a.m. The French advanced directly toward the British lines. While the well-trained regulars understood that their survival depended on maintaining formation, the militiamen had little understanding of the importance of an orderly advance. As soon as they were ordered forward, many broke into a run, even though the British line was still nearly 500 meters away. The formation quickly unraveled. One eyewitness recalled, quote, "We had not gone 20 paces before the left was too far in the rear and the center too far in the front." Montcalm was unable to restore order, and his army surged toward the disciplined British line like a swarm of bees. The Redcoats quietly awaited the French onslaught. Even when Montcalm's men stopped about 150 meters away to fire a volley, no one flinched. At that distance, the French musket fire had little effect. Aside from a few lucky shots, one of which shattered Wolfe's wrist, it did little damage. When the French reloaded, their formation fell apart. The regulars tried to hold the line, but the militiamen threw themselves to the ground, following tactics they had learned during training for forest warfare. When the first attackers came within 60 meters, the British troops on the flanks opened fire by platoons, unleashing deadly volleys into the disordered French ranks. The platoons in the center held their fire even longer, cutting down the advancing troops with devastating opening salvos at point-blank range. By the time the British had reloaded, the French were in retreat. As the Redcoats gave chase, native and Canadian snipers opened fire from the edges of the battlefield. On the far right, Wolfe himself led the 28th Louisbourg Grenadiers in the charge, when a sniper's bullet tore through his intestines, and another struck his chest. He lived just long enough to learn that the French were in full retreat, before finally meeting the heroic fate he had long desired. Leaderless, his men surged across the plains, cutting down fleeing French soldiers, until Field Marshal George Townshend took command and restored order. It was not a moment too soon. Townshend had barely managed to rally 2 battalions when Bougainville arrived on the battlefield. Finding Montcalm defeated and the British regrouping, he withdrew to reassess the situation. Wasting no time, Townshend called for the siege equipment and ordered his exhausted troops to begin digging trenches. At last, the formal siege of Quebec had begun. Meanwhile, Montcalm was dying. A round of grapeshot had torn through his abdomen and leg during the retreat. With his death, Quebec lost its only senior military commander, and command passed to the Governor-General of New France, the Marquis de Vaudreuil. Vaudreuil had only witnessed the end of the battle and was unsure what to do next. That afternoon, he convened a council of war. Everyone agreed there was only one option: retreat to the settlement of Jacques-Cartier, about 25 miles upriver on the St. Lawrence. Regroup and return to end the siege, hopefully before the garrison was forced to surrender. The city's garrison, made up mostly of militia and sailors, had food for only 3 days, and morale sank lower with every shovel the British drove into the ground. It didn't take much to push them towards surrender. On the 17th of September, with the British trenches completed and their artillery and warships ready to reduce the city to rubble, an envoy approached the British camp under truce flag. The next morning, the town's mayor signed the capitulation. The British entered Quebec, took control of the defenses, and began preparing for the inevitable counterattack. The remnants of the French army were less than a day's march away at St. Augustin when they received news of the capitulation. The Chevalier de Lévis Montcalm's successor, had rushed to the scene, but arrived too late. Without a proper siege train, most importantly heavy artillery, he was powerless against Quebec's defenses. He was forced to turn back, build a fort at Jacques-Cartier, and sent messengers to France to ask for reinforcements. Lévis was confident that the hardships of winter would work in his favor. He was well provisioned, while the British in Quebec were facing the consequences of Wolfe's scorched earth campaign. The surrounding countryside had been stripped bare, and once the St. Lawrence River froze, no British fleet could reach them. They would have to survive on the supplies they had brought with them. Anyone free to leave the city did so before winter set in. Among them was Townshend, who returned to England. When Admiral Saunders and his fleet weighed anchor in October, command passed to the junior brigadier James Murray. As commander of the garrison and governor of Quebec, he faced the bleak prospect of a long, brutal winter. When Amherst received word on the 18th of October that Quebec had fallen a few weeks earlier, he was on his way to attack the French post on Ile Onua. The long-awaited vessels from Ticonderoga had finally arrived about a week earlier, but heavy storms forced his fleet to shelter along the lakeshore. With the campaign's primary strategic objective achieved, Amherst saw no need to continue the attack. He called off the expedition, returned to Crown Point, and sent his troops to winter quarters. No sooner had Amherst received the news in his remote forest outpost than it reached London. Pitt had nearly given up hope, as Wolfe's last dispatches had been filled with complaints about his failing health and the many obstacles he faced over the summer. But now, as Pitt read Townshend's account of the battle on the Plains of Abraham and the surrender of Quebec, his mood shifted dramatically. He had the letter published in a newspaper to celebrate the victory. A wave of rejoicing swept through England and the American colonies, and James Wolfe was hailed as a hero. In 1760, many believed they would finally drive the French out of North America. After the celebrations, Pitt returned to the planning table. In Europe, France was under growing pressure. Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel had defeated the French forces at the Battle of Minden and pushed them back over the river Lahn. French finances were in disarray. They had already lost two of their most valuable overseas possessions, the sugar-rich island of Guadeloupe and their West African slave trading stations. And they now seemed likely to lose Canada as well. Moreover, the long-planned invasion of England had come to nothing. First, the British had blocked the French attempt to unite their Mediterranean fleet with the main force at Brest, and then mounting financial problems had slowed preparations. Still, France's armies remained intact, and the invasion, though delayed, was far from abandoned. On the 7th of November, a sudden opportunity arose. A fierce autumn gale swept across the English Channel, forcing the British squadrons that had maintained a continuous blockade of the French coast to take shelter along the shore. French Vice Admiral Hubert de Brienne seized the moment to rush his fleet toward Quiberon Bay, where the French invasion army awaited transport. This left the coasts of Scotland and Ireland briefly unguarded, but the British were aware of the danger. As soon as the storm passed, they returned to sea. On the 20th of November, both fleets converged on Quiberon Bay almost simultaneously. When the French spotted the British ships approaching, they tried to take shelter in the bay. But British Admiral Edward Hawke gave the order to attack. Instead of forming the conventional line of battle, Hawke trusted the superior seamanship of his crews and ordered his captains to attack at will. By the tactical standards of the time, this was sheer madness. The battle quickly dissolved into a chaotic melee. Vessels collided, crashed onto rocks, ran aground, and exchanged fire with frenzied intensity. But Hawke's gamble paid off. The French were stunned as the British ships swarmed around them. The fighting raged until nightfall. It wasn't until dawn that the full outcome became clear. Remarkably, the British emerged without losing a single ship, while the French lost 7, including the Vice Admiral's flagship. Additionally, 9 more French ships ran aground and were lost. The Battle of Quiberon Bay dealt a devastating blow to the French naval power, effectively ending any hope of the invasion of the British Isles. Although few contemporaries realized it at the time, the Battle of Quiberon Bay was probably the decisive victory of 1759. From a global perspective, it marked a major shift in the balance of power. With the British Channel Fleet now firmly in control, France was effectively cut off from reinforcing and supplying its overseas garrisons. In addition, the threat of invasion was off the table, freeing Pitt to focus on the Canadian war theatre. As a result, the instructions Pitt sent to Amherst on the 7th of January 1760 were straightforward: continue last season's campaign and complete the conquest of Canada. Amherst was ahead of his orders. He had worked tirelessly throughout the winter preparing to complete the conquest of Canada. When he received Pitt's instructions, he decided to proceed with a 3-pronged approach. An army of about 3,500 redcoats under Brigadier General William Haviland would pick up where Amherst had left off the previous year. They would start at Crown Point, capture Île-aux-Noix, and then advance along the Champlain corridor toward Montreal. James Murray, now Brigadier General, would lead a force from Quebec up the St. Lawrence River, and Amherst himself would lead an army 12,000 strong from Albany to Oswego, then down the St. Lawrence. If all went according to plan, these 3 forces would converge in Montreal at the same time. At Montreal, however, the Chevalier de Lévis had no intention of waiting idly for the British to come to him. He was making plans of his own. To avoid disaster, his priority was to retake Quebec. The conditions were promising. Wolfe's devastating campaign had forced many Quebecois to seek refuge upriver near Montreal, giving Lévis several thousand men eager to drive the British out. He had the manpower and supplies needed to lay siege to Quebec. The only thing missing was heavy artillery, which he expected to arrive from France after the spring thaw. To guard his back against an attack up the Champlain corridor, he dispatched Captain Pouchot, the former commander of Niagara. Having recently returned in a prisoner exchange, Pouchot was now ready to make the British fight for every inch of the Montreal district. On the 20th of April, Lévis ordered 7,000 men down the St. Lawrence. Apart from Pouchot's detachments and the garrison at Montreal and Île-aux-Noix, this was practically every able-bodied soldier he had. No guns had yet arrived from France, so the army's artillery consisted merely of, quote, 12 miserable old cannons. The river had thawed just enough to allow the French boats and 2 frigates to sail downstream. On the 24th of April, they landed at Pointe-aux-Trembles and continued overland toward Quebec. 3 days later, the advance guard reached the village of Saint-Foy, where Murray and his soldiers were waiting. Murray's men had suffered greatly through the harsh winter. With inadequate clothing, the Highlanders had only their kilts and whatever Scotsmen traditionally wore underneath. They were cold, starving, and plagued by disease. By April, these hardships had reduced Murray's effective fighting force to fewer than 4,000 sickly and exhausted men. When he learned the French-Canadian army was approaching, he decided to buy time by setting up a defensive line at Saint-Foy. Both armies hoped that their reinforcements would arrive first. When Lévis encountered the British field fortifications at Saint-Foy, he refrained from launching a direct assault. Instead, he waited until nightfall to outflank them. Aware of this threat, Murray withdrew to the Plains of Abraham. Knowing his men could not endure a prolonged siege, he hoped to defeat Lévis in open battle. Although the French army was larger, it was largely composed of militia, and Murray hoped for a repeat of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. On the morning of the 28th of April, He arrayed about 3,800 men on the ridge, where Montcalm had formed his line of battle 7 months ago. He was, as Fred Anderson puts it, quote, about to reenact the Battle of Quebec. Levis gladly seized the opportunity to fight a pitched battle. On an open field, the absence of heavy artillery was less of a disadvantage. Although only about 3,800 of his troops had arrived, he ordered them to form a line. Murray, hoping to strike a decisive blow before the rest of the French-Canadian army assembled, made a critical mistake. He ordered his men to abandon the high ground and attack. The plain was still blanketed in wet, knee-deep snow, concealing a swamp of mud that made it nearly impossible for Murray's exhausted troops to advance quickly. By the time they finally reached the French line, Levis' forces were fully deployed and ready. More than an hour of brutal close-quarter fighting followed. Eventually, both British flanks collapsed, and Murray was forced to order a retreat, abandoning his hopelessly trapped field guns. Within hours, he found himself where Montcalm had stood the previous fall, behind the walls of Quebec, while Levis was in Townshend's former position, preparing to open the siege trenches. By the 11th of May, the French had completed their siege works, positioned their artillery, and were ready to bombard Quebec. Murray's only hope was for reinforcements from Britain. When the first warships appeared on the St. Lawrence below Quebec on the evening of the 12th of May, the fact that they were not the Lilies of France, but the Union Jack, compelled Levis to immediately raise the siege. By the morning of the 13th of May, the French were rowing for their lives. 2 British warships pursued them upriver and would likely have destroyed Levis's entire retreating army had it not been for the heroic stand of Captain Jean Vauquelin aboard his frigate Atalante. Vauquelin anchored his ship near the Point Tremblant, nailed his colors to the mast, and fought fiercely to buy time for the retreat. He held out until his gunners ran out of powder. Still refusing to surrender, he ordered his crew to abandon ship, threw his sword into the St. Lawrence, and waited calmly for the British to take him prisoner. With Levis's retreat, the last barrier on the Quebec front was gone. By the 13th of July, Murray set off for Montreal. His force of about 2,000 moved upriver in a formidable convoy, 32 armed vessels, 9 floating batteries, and scores of smaller boats navigating the St. Lawrence. At the Richelieu Rapids, a narrow, treacherous stretch guarded by French shore batteries, they broke through a blockade. From there, the strongest resistance came not from the French, but from the river itself. Powerful currents and contrary winds turned the journey into a slow grind. French troops shadowed the flotilla along the banks, hoping to prevent a landing, but failed to do even that. Murray was in no hurry, stopping at every major village to proclaim its conquest and open trade. On the 1st of September, the army landed near the parish of Varennes, just across the river from Montreal. Resistance was feeble. Murray entrenched his force and waited for the arrival of the 2 other British armies. Amherst and Haviland departed from Oswego and Crown Point almost simultaneously, on the 10th and 11th of August respectively, and reached their first obstacles at the same time. On the 16th of August, Amherst arrived at Fort Levis, the island's stronghold held by Captain Pouchot, while Haviland landed his troops opposite the fort Illinois, preparing to lay siege. Illinois proved a tough nut to crack. With nearly a year to prepare for the British assault, Bougainville had flooded the surrounding lowlands and stationed a radeau, a floating gun platform, and a schooner just downstream of the island to block any British attempts to bypass the fort. Haviland responded with brute force, unleashing a thunderous artillery barrage. On the 25th of August, British forces seized the radeau and the schooner, putting Bougainville in a precarious position. That night, he silently abandoned the fort. During his retreat toward Montreal, he burned the remaining forts at Saint-Jean and Chambly. Haviland, meanwhile, was delayed by a stream of residents and deserters coming forward to swear allegiance. Nonetheless, he pressed on overland toward the St. Lawrence. Meanwhile, Amherst had been bombarding Captain Pouchot and his small garrison at Fort Levy for over a week. When they finally surrendered, the British pressed forward, only to confront the most dangerous obstacle of their long advance, the rapids of the upper St. Lawrence. The siege of Fort Levy had cost 21 lives. The grueling waters devoured at least 4 times as many. Despite their vulnerability while navigating the treacherous rapids, neither Canadian militia nor native warriors harassed them. On the 5th of September, the Western Army made camp on Ile Perrot within sight of Montreal, still nearly in step with Haviland's column, which arrived on the southern shore. Seeing the British forces closing in from 3 directions, Lévis withdrew all his regulars to Montreal. The island city, unlike Quebec, was no imposing fortress. Its defenses consisted of a shallow dry ditch and a low wall, sufficient to deter a native raid, perhaps, but wholly inadequate to withstand a siege by a European army equipped with artillery. Lévis knew the situation was dire, and so did the population. By the time the British armies reached the city, most of the militia had vanished into thin air. All that remained to defend Montreal were about 4,000 men, many of them sick or wounded, or both. Lévis' last hope rested with his native allies. On the 4th of September, he summoned the chiefs of the local villages to a war council at La Prairie, hoping they would join him in a final strike against the British. The indigenous communities of the St. Lawrence missions had, until now, been steadfast allies. But just as Lévis was making his appeal, an envoy from one of the upriver villages stepped into the council's circle and announced that his people had made peace with Amherst. In an instant, the mood shifted. The chiefs quietly rose and dispersed, leaving Lévis to prepare for a final stand, alone. The outcome of the La Prairie Conference revealed just how decisive indigenous support was. Thanks in part to George Croghan's unofficial trading efforts, the truce secured by the Treaty of Easton had held firm. Meanwhile, Sir William Johnson's diplomacy helped bring the Iroquois Confederacy into the British fold. Amherst marched with 700 Iroquois warriors at his side, and it was their presence that paved the way for the British. Wherever these allies appeared, their mere arrival persuaded local tribes not only to stand down, but often to actively support the British cause. Mohawk guides helped navigate the treacherous rapids of the upper St. Lawrence, and villages that had once sustained the French now welcomed Amherst's men. Without this indigenous support, his campaign would have been neither so swift nor so bloodless. 2 days after the Conference of La Prairie, Murray and Haviland joined forces on the southern shore of the St. Lawrence, while Amherst crossed over to Ile de Montreal and made camp near the settlement of Lachine. At dawn, just as they were about to set off toward the city, a lone rider approached under a white flag. It was Bougainville, sent by Governor General Vaudreuil to propose a truce. Amherst bluntly responded, quote, "He had come to Canada and he did not intend to take anything less." Unless Vaudreuil offered an outright capitulation, the siege preparations would proceed. When Bougainville returned to Montreal with the ultimatum, tensions ran high. The proud and battle-hardened Lévis urged continued resistance, but Vaudreuil, faced with a city overcrowded with refugees, critically short on guns, and weakly defended, eventually persuaded him to strike the flag. Continued resistance, though honorable, would have led to needless sacrifice. At noon, Bougainville returned to Amherst with Vaudreuil's terms of surrender. The British commander-in-chief agreed to most of them. The French residents who remained in the colony were free to practice their faith, retain their property, and live in peace. The only point of contention was how to deal with the defeated troops. Amherst denied them an honorable surrender. He was determined to punish, quote, "the infamous part of the troops of France that had acted in exciting the savages to penetrate the most horrid and unheard of barbarities of the whole progress of the war," end quote. the French regulars were to return to France without the honors of war and on the condition that they would not fight again in the current conflict. Although Lévis and his officers protested, Vaudreuil accepted. His task as Governor General was not to protect their honor, but the well-being of all French subjects in New France. On the 8th of September 1760, Vaudreuil and Lévis surrendered the entire French colony of Canada. The remainder of the French army laid down their arms. Lévis, not able to bear the shame of surrendering his sword, snapped it in two. Although officially the war only ended with the global 7 Years' War in 1763, fighting in America ceased after the surrender of Montreal. The British conquest of New France was complete. Thank you for watching the video. I hope it's clear that this video took a lot of time and effort, a lot of research, animation, illustration, double checking, going back, redoing parts, and so on. We love to do this, but it's not easy and it takes a lot of resources. If you think these kinds of videos are worth your money, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It's a good way to support any creator. And for us, it means that we remain independent and can produce videos on topics that we like and that we think are important. So we don't have to cater to hype and trends, which in our opinion doesn't work well for a channel about history. Thank you.